Hello everybody, in this video what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue the lecture on what does it mean to be human, but talk about how this understanding in the psychological literature has fundamentally changed in the past 20 years. Now before we start talking about this revolution, I would argue, in the dehumanization literature, we need to talk about kind of the state of the field before the year 2000, and that it was focused on this blatant intergroup dehumanization, and you can see that into the images of the left. On the far left we have Americans being dehumanized by these machines of war just destroying everything. And then to the right you have an infamous propaganda poster from the Nazis depicting Jewish individuals as rats. So dehumanization research before the year 2000s was very much focused on this intergroup conflict, especially in extreme cases, and how using dehumanization could lead to a sense of moral exclusion. And that this would lead these groups to be able to engage in the types of atrocities they did because their victims were no longer human. Or it was a way for them to justify past atrocities against their victims, because what would happen is that they no longer had to feel shame or guilt to doing that to another human being. So we'll talk a bit more about this idea of moral exclusion and how this helps with a sense of shame or guilt or allowing people to engage in certain types of atrocities later in the term. And what we actually see with a lot of the studies in dehumanization is that often the form of dehumanization would be calling the other group animals or even demons and devils. And this was all done very explicitly with intentions for some other purpose, such as annihilation. However, since this time, what we actually see is that about starting in 2000-2001, dehumanization research took a huge turn and started focusing on what would be understood as more everyday types of dehumanization. Now, pretty much the start of this revolution was Jacques-Philippe Lyons and colleagues' infrahumanization theory. Now, according to infrahumanization theory, individuals are going to associate their group with the fully human essence. So to be part of the in-group is to possess that fully human essence, but what that means is that members that are outside of your in-group are going to actually have a lesser or infra-human essence, and they're going to be associated more with animals than they are going to be with full humans. Now, one of the most important things to understand about infrahumanization and why it's so important to the studying of the human concept is that this introduces this idea that people are going to deny other people's full humanity, not at an explicit conscious level, but at an implicit level. Now, what does this mean? Well, what this is going to mean is that Group A is going to identify their group with being fully human, so they're going to attribute it these more uniquely human characteristics. And those are going to be essentially a proxy or a reflection of the human essence. Now, an example of these uniquely human characteristics are secondary emotions. Secondary emotions are those more complex emotions that are viewed to be more unique to humans. Things such as nostalgia or melancholy. And what Lyons found in a lot of studies, and a lot of other people have since supported, is that individuals tend to attribute their group with more uniquely human characteristics than an outgroup. Now, another important thing to understand about this process is that they're not just attributing their group all of these different characteristics and that's it. It tends to be only limited to more uniquely human characteristics. For example, we can talk about primary emotions. Primary emotions are very basic emotions that we can share with other animals. For example, you may have seen dogs very happy or surprised or disgusted. Those are emotions that are experienced not just by humans, but other animals as well. And what studies show is that there's really no difference in distribution of primary emotions between the in-group and the out-group. And if there is, it tends to be that the out-group is attributed more primary emotions, or ones that are shared with animals, than the in-group. And all of this is going to happen outside of the context with conflict. All you really need are some meaningful groups, and then you're setting the stage for this infrahumanization. And not only do you not need conflict, but we actually see that participants are going to attribute their in-group even negative uniquely human characteristics rather than the out-group. So it's very important for them that it's not just we're better than them, it's we're more human than them. And again, this is not happening at an explicit level. The participant only thinks that they're attributing these different types of emotions to one group or another, and it just so happens that they're attributing their own group more uniquely human emotions than the out-group. So in essence, these participants are often engaging in dehumanization without actually knowing that they are. So something else that needs to be discussed is that Lyons actually tried to distinguish infrahumanization from dehumanization. He wanted dehumanization to maintain its kind of notability as something that's more extreme and explicit, rather than his infrahumanization, which was much more implicit and less extreme. However, and we'll get into this a little bit later in this lecture about the debate between what is actually dehumanization, but I do think we should consider infrahumanization as a form of dehumanization, because individuals are being denied their full humanity by lacking certain uniquely human characteristics, or possessing them to a lesser degree than oneself. Now what I want to do is I want to discuss one of the studies that Lyons used to introduce infrahumanization theory with. Now in this study he had participants from Spain that were either high status, and these were the Peninsulars, as well as low status, and these were the Canarians. And this was the participants in group. Now each participant was given a small booklet that had some words in some random order. And some of these were going to be secondary emotions, things such as nostalgia, compassion, pride, and remorse. And then 4 others were going to be primary emotions: courage, astonishment and fear, surprise, and exaltation. Now participants were tasked to select from this list of words what reflected either their in-group, or for the other half, the out-group. So for example, if a peninsular was assigned the in-group, they would select words for the Peninsulars. If they were assigned the out-group, the Peninsulars would select words for the Canarians. And then the Canarians did the same with their in-group or their out-group, depending on where they were assigned the in-group or out-group conditions. Now it's important to understand that although there is difference in status, there's really no conflict between these two groups, at least not in any kind of explicit way. And the participants didn't even know they were attributing a sense of humanness to either their group or the out-group, depending on the condition they were assigned. They thought they were just selecting words that reflected the group they were assigned. Now if we look to the left, we can actually look at the results. And here, the blue bar is going to be the in-group. So this is Peninsulars rating Peninsulars and Canarians rating Canarians. Now the orange is going to be rating the out-group. So Peninsulars, Canarians, Canarians, Peninsulars. And the pair on the left side is going to be for secondary emotions, so uniquely human. And on the right, we have primary emotions, or those that are shared with animals. And what Lyons and colleagues found is that the in-groups did attribute themselves more secondary emotions than they attributed to the out-groups. And something else that they found, and they didn't quite expect this, was that individuals attributed the out-group more primary emotions than they did to the in-group. So again, it's not that the in-group is just attributing itself more characteristics, it's just attributing itself more human characteristics than the out-group. And then in the second study, they actually found the same thing, but they found it with both positive and negative emotions. And what this means is that individuals are willing to view themselves more negatively, as long as it means that they're still more human. Now later on, we're going to talk about the different types of boundaries and limitations that infrahumanization theory has come across, and I believe it has been replaced by a theory that we're going to talk about next. We still can't undersell the importance of the introduction of this theory, because it took dehumanization from the context of only understanding it within extreme intergroup conflict into more implicit everyday processes. And what later studies have found, and we're going to review these pretty much in depth later on, is that dehumanization is something that happens pretty much every day, and it happens across several different groups. And this can actually have some negative consequences for the targets of being infrahumanized. Now that is it for this video. In the next video, I'm actually going to talk about the theory and model that I actually think replaces infrahumanization theory in a way that it actually kind of subsumes it but extends it beyond just this uniquely human component. And then after that, we'll talk about this kind of debate about dehumanization.